debate. We're looking at Rwanda 20 years after the 1994 genocide. Earlier in the day, a flame lit that will burn for 100 days. That was the amount of time it took to kill 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. We're talking about it with Johan SWINNEN. He was Belgium's ambassador to Kigali from 1990 to 94 and is the author of the forthcoming book, Post-Kigali, Memories of the Rwandan Tragedy. Gérard PRUNIER, fellow at the Atlantic Council, whose books include The Rwanda Crisis, History of a Genocide. Benjamin SEHENE, writer whose first book, The Ethnique Trap, inspired by his return to Kigali in 1994. And France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent, who's just back from the Rwandan capital. Benjamin, when you're far away when you hear the news of what's going on. Remember 1994, there aren't many images, there's not many pictures.
No.
And what makes you decide, I've got to go back?
Well, I was in touch with relatives, and I had some relatives in Uganda. So I knew what was going on, and I thought the reporting at the time in France was unfair because the picture one would, someone who didn't know Rwanda would have got, at the time was a very, well, like a cartoonish picture of Africans, African tribes fighting between themselves. And I wanted to explain how first I became a refugee, and then the fact that people who had stayed in Rwanda were always under the threat of being massacred for one reason or another. It happened in the 60s, in the 70s, and for me it was no surprise that it was going to happen. You know, we had once there was a massacre in Bugesera that was like a mock rehearsal for the genocide in '94, and this happened in '92. A lot of people were killed, and it was it all started with a broadcast on the radio alleging some infiltration of Tutsis in the Bugesera region.
And that was enough to spark it. Let me get your reaction to a comment from one of the viewers, Sheriff, saying Rwandans should forget about the past. Although it's painful, but they have to. They should concentrate on developing their country and put in place good institutions for their country. What would you answer to Sheriff there?
Well, forgetting is one thing, but forgetting would be allowing the possibility of a future genocide, probably, and it was it is essential to keep the memory of what happened, because I fear that the particularity of Rwanda is that the victims live with their well, killers or killers of their relatives, and forgetting would be doing an injustice to the survivors.
And to Gérard's point that, you know, the Yugoslavs killed each other for events that happened in the 15th century, that the spark could be relit any moment.
Yes, sure. And there is always the possibility that in future it happens. So the best way of combating, first of all, the negationist views. I went to the trial of Pascal Simbikwanga.
He's the first Rwandan to be tried on French soil, and this happened just months ago.
And I was surprised by the way he's in denial, but in a strange denial. He even denies that he never saw any bodies in Kigali in those 3 months, or never smelled the bodies. And yet when I went there this was sometime in June, July, the Kigali was, one big stench. And you could smell bodies everywhere. And there were even some bodies that were still visible. But the fact is that, the people who planned and executed the genocide continued living in denial can only lead us to the same thing.
The events that happened in that month of June include the French launching Operation Turquoise. The aim, say authorities at the time in Paris, is to provide a humanitarian corridor to stop the killing. It's still a bitter bone of contention. We heard Ambassador SWINNEN in part one of the discussion saying there were these calls for help. No one answered them. Paris's view, we're the only ones who came and stepped in. But of course, what ensued was humanitarian disaster and accusations that they were acting as a cover for retreating Hutus.
Well, no, that was wrong. The members of the Genocide government that were evacuated by the French were evacuated by the French Secret Service and not by this cumbersome, enormous apparatus of the Turquoise operation. If you want to take out 50 people, you take helicopters or some cars or whatever, you do it discreetly. It was done by the French, but not under the cover of Turquoise. This was completely different. Turquoise was what I called in my book an effort by President Mitterrand to wash his bloody hands in the humanitarian water. They almost made a mistake because they almost went to the north, to Ruhengeri. In Ruhengeri, there were no more Tutsis to be saved. They were all dead. So this is why I gave them, I was part of the planning group. I gave them the advice of going through the south. Because I said, there you can still save a few people. At least if that's what you want to do, be coherent and go to the place where you still have a few Tutsi who are alive. And so that's what they did. They came through Bukavu instead of coming through Goma.
And you were at the time, you told us before how you at the time had to go and meet Kagame to try to establish relations. Yeah. Is it the same man today as back then?
No, I think he's much more tense now because he knows he's under pressure and he has lost his cool. He was a very cool guy. When we were there with my friend Jean-Christophe Ruffin, Colonel Tauzin was a dubious character in the French army, said that he was in Kibungo, I think. He said he would ne pas faire de quartier, which in French means
spare no
kill
lives,
the wounded.
Basically.
Yeah, and Kagame did not understand when he read the dispatch. So he asked one of his officers who understood French, and he said, the guy said, "Sir, it means they will kill the wounded." So Kagame looked at me and said, "That's a rather unfriendly remark." So he was very cool. Now he has lost his cool completely.
All right, let's see what he said. A few years back, Paris and Kigali restoring diplomatic relations. A new chill on the eve of the ceremony with the interview that Kagame granted to Newsweekly Jeune Afrique. In that interview, he says that the reproach that had been made, that not enough lives had been saved during the genocide, is a fact, but it masks the essential, the direct role that Belgium, the former colonial power, and France played in the political preparation of the genocide and even in its execution. Is Johan SWINNEN, your reaction to that?
I would like to leave this reply to my political authorities. But nevertheless, I'm very surprised. How is this possible? How can one pretend that the Belgians were actively engaged in the preparation of a genocide? As you said at the start of this debate, I've been there from 90, before the first attack of the RPF, when everything was quiet, or more or less quiet, till the evacuation, 6 days after the beginning of the genocide, after the attack against the plane. So I've gone through all this. And every day, my country, our policy, our diplomacy, the people in the field, the ambassador, we were pleading for moderation. We were liked and appreciated by the moderate, positive forces of this country. And of course, we have to regret the implosion of this democratic, moderate center. And we were making demarches almost every day against the radio, against the violation of human rights, in favor of inquiries after the massacres. But we did it also in Mulindi, in the Maquis, with Major Kagame. And we told him also, and we asked him whether his radio, Muhabura, was maybe also not in conformity of the Arusha agreements. So we were all the time relentlessly advocating moderation and insisting on respect for human rights, inquiries, etc. So how you can still pretend that we were preparing actively the genocide? So this is ununderstandable.
And in those opening days of the genocide, there's the guards of the Prime Minister, Belgian peacekeepers, 10 of them who are killed. You evacuate, so does the UN mission at that time.
And not only military, our paratroopers were killed, 12 Belgian civilians were killed. The radio, RTLM, was calling for killing the Belgians. Everybody had to kill his Belgian. I was on top of the list. I was warned in the first hours after the downing of the plane that I was on the list, that I had to stay home.
So in light of the remarks made by Kagame in that interview, how do you feel about Ban Ki-moon's apology at the National Stadium today?
I think apologies are... I've always told to my Belgian authorities as well, because our Prime Minister presented apologies some years ago in an early stage. Apologies is all right if you tell everything. If you add also that Belgium was very much committed, engaged for peace and reconciliation and human rights and democracy in the years before the genocide. Of course, when you talk about what happened in the first days, the withdrawal of the UN troops, that's indeed that's another debate. That's another debate. We Belgians, we could not do otherwise, because the Belgians, as I told you, were killed. But the entire withdrawal, the integral withdrawal of the UN troops was indeed a very difficult and awkward decision.
All right, we have one viewer agreeing with what Benjamin said earlier, saying avoiding the truth about what happened and lack of justice might take Rwanda back in dark periods. It is important to remember that viewer says. Paris, by the way, scrapping the attendance of its justice minister in Kigali. In reprisal, the French ambassador did not get accreditation to attend this Monday's ceremony. A decision to downsize that delegation was approved by the man who was foreign minister at the time of the genocide, conservative politician Alain Juppé.
An operation to falsify history is regularly undertaken by the Kigali regime. It's both dishonest and insulting for France, and this is why I've commented on this topic. I will not reopen the debate, the arguments are well known, and I believe that we have been right to keep our distance from the regime by not sending a minister.
All right, and this Monday in his speech, Rwanda's president denouncing what he labeled the righteousness of foreign powers.
The passage of time should not obscure the facts, lessen the responsibility, or turn victims into villains. People cannot be bribed or forced into changing their history, and no country is powerful enough, even when they think they are, to change the facts.
Gérard Prunier, your comments on what Kagame was saying there, and also on the tone employed by Paris since the weekend.
Well, no, as a historian, I find it very difficult, all this, because this is mishmash. We have to sort it out. First of all, the Belgians are completely innocent of all that. I totally agree with the ambassador, number one. Number two, the French, it's much more ambiguous. We were co-belligerent in that war. I nearly got killed by an artillery fire in 1992 on the hill behind Mulindi. So, I mean, these were French artillerymen. I was listening to them on the radio. They were talking with the troops. They were shooting. So we were part in the war. But we did not do anything about the genocide. That I know. Because I was a member of the International Secretariat of the French Socialist Party. I was all the time at the Élysée in contact with the first Jean-Christophe Mitterrand and then later Bruno Delay. I mean, this is totally ridiculous poppycock. It's asinine. I don't know, or rather, yes, I understand why Kagame is doing it. Kagame is under a lot of political pressure right now. He's afraid of being overthrown by Tutsi, by his own friends who are now revolting against him. And they are making alliances with former genocidaires of the FDLR. I mean, those guys of Kayumba Nyamwasa, Rudasingwa, and so on. So he's under intense political pressure. Why did he pick that particular time now? I think, frankly, he doesn't care much about Belgium or France. His target is Washington. And he knows the Americans are dropping him. The Americans used to support him. The Americans are fed up with him. They're dropping him.
Fed up with him because of...
Because of the Congo, because of all the mayhem that he has created in the region. So they're tired of him. And, so he needs to have a counterattack of some kind. He's a clever politician, so he's using whatever means are at his disposal. I think he's unburying these old quarrels, and which are very ambiguous in the case of France, because France does have quite a bit of responsibility in the genocide, not because they prepared it. I totally disagree with Patrick de Saint-Exupéry, when he says the French were planning the genocide. This is another ridiculous figment of his imagination. But politically, militarily, the French engaged with the Habyarimana regime to the point where they gave the Habyarimana regime, and not so much Habyarimana himself, who was much more of a moderate, but the people around him, like Bagosora and others, we can go to the end. We can have the final solution, And that is the responsibility of the French. It's a political and moral responsibility. It was not the preparation of the genocide. We didn't buy guns and machetes to give to the Interahamwe. But we created the conditions where such a thing became possible. You could think about it, especially crazy extremists like there were around the president. They thought, the French are behind us. I remember when Turquoise soldiers came, those guys thought the French were coming to help them. They ran around brandishing French flags, saying the French army is here to back us up. So, if there was this ambiguity, it means they could think that. The thought was present in their minds. That is what the French are guilty of, not what Mr. Alain Juppé is talking about. And Mr. Alain Juppé is being very dishonest about it. He was in power at the time. I remember very well his activities and his actions, and there would be a lot to say about it.
Benjamin SEHENE, your thoughts on the timing of this new war of words between Paris and Kigali?
To come back to what Mr. Ambassador was saying, the Belgians have a responsibility in a way, because a historical responsibility from the time of the independence, and I think that is the context in which President Kagame was talking. But I don't. He has always. I don't see why France reacted the way it did, because he has. Rwanda has always talked of France's responsibility and even the Belgian responsibility.
I've heard that said over the past weekend. This is nothing new, what Kagame has said.
No. Well, he's not saying anything new. He's saying it at a time maybe that doesn't, that inconveniences France, because it is the anniversary of the genocide. But otherwise, the line has always been that for France to accept its responsibility as well as the historical responsibility of the colonial powers at the time of independence.
Catherine Nostrand, your trips to Rwanda, you didn't cover, of course, the 1994 genocide.
No, I didn't know. A bit too young back then.
Today, do you sense this bad blood between the authorities in Kigali and Paris when you're there?
Well, put it this way, as a British journalist, you don't have to get a visa. As a French journalist, you have to go through the embassy and wait quite a long time. So, there are signs like that. I mean, in terms of on the ground, when you're there, I mean, a lot of the people we spoke to, some of the older generations, still anger. When you talk to them about it, not on the surface, resentment about the role of France especially. The younger generation, perhaps not politically involved on that level there. I mean, a lot of them now are English-speaking. France, Rwanda is turning away from French and to English. So you see the signs of it there. But that kind of animosity with the people we were filming with, we did a report about young people in Rwanda and how they see the future. It's not an historic grudge that they...
This is an argument for old men?
Perhaps it is. I mean, it's still very much current, as we're seeing at the moment on the political level, and the fact that comes out. I mean, Kagame made a speech, an incendiary speech at the 10th anniversary of the genocide. So there's clearly, this is a thing about using a stage as well and using the moment to make an impact. He knows how to make an impact. But it's just something he said several times, and he says it isn't him making accusations, but he repeats that these are the facts of history as he sees it. And he's repeated this again and again in many interviews. And he's trying to get the view across that this is not his argument, this is not Rwanda's position, these are the facts. And that's the view he's trying to get across.
You heard Gérard PRUNIER earlier in the conversation say how he sees him as a more tense man than he was 2 decades ago. Do you sense that tension?
Well, I didn't meet him 2 decades ago, but when you go to a press conference, I went in 2010 to cover the election then, and a press conference with the international media.
An election where the main opposition candidate did not stand, and she's now in prison.
She's now in prison, Victoire Ingabire, but the opposition parties in Rwanda are very small. There's very little political space for them. So he was facing a lot of questions from the international media about the state of democracy in Rwanda, and he was very tense answering to those. The responses came back with saying, well, that's a colonial, an imperialist question, a question from a colonial power. And there were no real answers to those kinds of accusations.
Johan, SWINNEN?
Yeah, that's important, democracy. I think democracy is a relative concept, notion. We do it in Belgium, you in France, you in Britain, and you in Rwanda on our own way. And I think we should stop giving the impression that the Africans are pleasing the Europeans by organizing elections. Every country organizes its democracy on its own way, following its own traditions, economic, social circumstances, development, etc. And I think, and I'm very much intrigued, very much interested how Rwanda, in this parcours difficile, is going to try to find a way, a democratic way, a way that allows people to participate in affairs, but in its own authentical Rwandan way, without European or Western recipes.
And
But
we'll
on
leave
the
it
other
there.
hand,
We'll leave it there, unfortunately, because we're running short on time. But trying to find a Rwandan way, of course, would be the way to go. Ambassador SWINNEN, I want to thank you. I want to thank Catherine Norris-Trent, Gérard PRUNIER, Benjamin SEHENE. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Beyond Business.
France has seen a steep drop in manufacturing jobs, and some say it makes the country not only poorer, but also less secure. In Beyond Business, we look at the link between manufacturing and national security, comparing France to the United States.
Beyond Business, en France 24, en France24.com.